Hello and welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. We are truly grateful for your continued support as we explore the universe together. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep our operations running. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hard-working team to survive and continue creating these tales for you, which you can do by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description or comments of this video. There is an ancient, unspoken law etched into the very fabric of the galaxy. Do not ambush a human ship. The Kalan Empire, blinded by centuries of absolute supremacy, believed themselves above this warning. They thought they were the apex predators of the cosmos. They were about to learn that humanity does not survive in the dark by being prey. The Ring Nebula was a graveyard of starlight, a swirling mass of cosmic dust and dead echoes spanning millions of miles. It was here, in the absolute freezing silence of deep space, that the Kalan Empire laid their snare. The Kalan were not creatures of flesh and bone. They were beings of pure, searing plasma, contained within masterfully forged magnetic armors that gave them towering, imposing silhouettes. To them, biological life was a fleeting, fragile joke. They had conquered dozens of star systems, subjugated billions of souls, and had grown drunk on their own invincibility. This sheer arrogance led them to ignore the single, most pervasive warning shared among the older, wiser species. Commander Vale of the Kalan Imperial Vanguard stood on the bridge of his dreadnought, watching the tactical display with a cold, crackling hum of amusement. His prey was perfectly isolated. The target was the United Space Command Observer, a solitary human science vessel. To Vale's advanced sensors, the ship was laughably pathetic. It possessed zero offensive weaponry. Its hull lacked even the most basic reactive armor, looking dangerously thin and fragile against the harsh radiation of the nebula. Right now, it was crawling at a sublight pace, casually sweeping the dust clouds to collect geological samples. It was a lamb wandering blindly into a den of wolves. "Activate the electromagnetic tether," Vial commanded, his voice a synthesized roar of static and absolute authority. In the void, a massive net of pure energy erupted from the stealth-cloaked Kalan ships. It lashed across the dark, slamming directly into the human vessel. The effect was instantaneous. The United Space Command Observer shuddered violently as its main thrusters flickered and died. The faint, blue glow of its engines faded into the pitch black of the nebula. To Vale, it was a flawless execution. It was an entirely bloodless capture. The humans were sitting ducks, their technology ready to be stripped and analyzed. "Open a direct transmission to their bridge," Vial ordered, leaning forward, eager to see the terror on the faces of these frail, carbon-based creatures. "Let them look upon their captors." The main viewing screen flickered to life. However, the image that materialized was not one of frantic chaos, blaring alarms, or desperate screaming. The bridge of the human ship was dimly lit, bathed in the soft amber glow of emergency backup lights. Sitting calmly in the center of the frame was Commander Elliot Budd. He was not wearing a heavy combat suit. He was dressed in a worn, comfortably loose uniform. He did not look at the screen with wide eyes or trembling hands. In fact, he was holding a steaming mug of coffee. The silence stretched between the two vessels, heavy and suffocating. Bud took a slow, deliberate sip. He swallowed, lowered the mug, and simply raised an eyebrow at the towering plasma entity glaring at him through the screen. "By the decree of the Kalan Empire, your vessel is now our property," Vial announced, projecting his voice to shake the very bulkheads of the human ship. "Surrender your databanks and prepare for boarding. Any resistance will result in your immediate incineration." Bud did not flinch. He did not beg. He did not even look particularly annoyed. He just let out a long, tired sigh. The kind of sigh a veteran mechanic gives when looking at a machine someone else just broke out of sheer ignorance. "This is the United Space Command Observer," Bud said, his voice terrifyingly steady and conversational. "I am Commander Bud. Before you do anything incredibly stupid, I strongly suggest you run a full diagnostic on your own life support systems." The bridge of the Kalen dreadnought went perfectly still. For a brief second, confusion rippled through the plasma entities. Did this fragile bag of water just threaten them? Vial threw his head back, letting out a booming, static-laced laugh that echoed across the communication channel. It was the most pathetic bluff he had ever witnessed in his 4 centuries of military service. The human ship was completely dead in the water, powered down and entirely defenseless. Yet this primate had the audacity to issue a warning. "Your empty words will not save you, human," Vial sneered, stepping closer to the console. He cut the transmission, leaving the lingering image of the calm, coffee-drinking commander etched in his mind. Vial turned to his tactical officers. "Launch the boarding crafts. I want every single one of those animals brought to me alive. Let us see how arrogant he is when we pull him from his chair." The heavy bay doors of the dreadnought slid open, releasing a swarm of sleek, heavily armed dropships into the void, darting straight toward the crippled human vessel. The trap was sprung, but the true nature of the prey in the dark was yet to be revealed. The sleek Kalen dropships tore through the vacuum, a swarm of predatory mechanical beasts eager to tear into the metal flesh of their prey. Their thrusters burned with violent purple energy, closing the distance in mere seconds. Inside the cockpits, the Kalen boarding teams readied their neural disruption rifles, anticipating a quick, brutal subjugation. The human vessel sat motionless, looming larger in their targeting visors. Then, reality snapped. There was no shockwave, no warning klaxon, no electromagnetic pulse. The dropships were mere meters away from breaching the human hull when their forward momentum simply ceased. The Kalen pilots pushed their throttles to maximum acceleration, the plasma engines screaming in overdrive. But the ships did not move forward. Instead, they began to drift backward. The propulsion vectors had seamlessly inverted without a single mechanical failure or unauthorized command. It was not a violent repulse. It was an eerily gentle, undeniable retraction, like a child pulling back a toy on a string. The invisible force dragged the entire strike force in perfect synchronization, guiding them precisely back into the dreadnought hangar bays. Panic erupted across the Kalen communication network. Pilots slammed their fists into control panels, screaming at their navigation computers. But the ships glided backward, perfectly locked in an impossible trajectory. On the bridge of the dreadnought, Commander Vial watched the tactical display in utter disbelief. His strike force was retreating against its own will. "What is the meaning of this?" Vial roared, his plasma form flaring with dangerous intensity. "Did they hack our navigation, override the lockdown protocols immediately?" Down in the depths of the Kalen warship, the chief engineer stared at his diagnostic monitors, his magnetic containment suit trembling. The data scrolling across his screens made no logical sense. "Commander," the chief engineer stammered over the primary channel, his voice high-pitched with terror. "They did not hack us. They did not fire a weapon. Sir, the human vessel just broadcasted a localized transmission. It is not a cyber attack. It is a mathematical equation." Vial slammed his fist onto the tactical table. "An equation? What are you babbling about?" "The transmission altered the fundamental constants of physics within a 100-kilometer radius," the engineer cried out. "They rewrote the laws of thermodynamics in our sector. Our engines are pushing forward, but the universe around us is dictating that our forward thrust results in backward motion. It is impossible, but it is happening." Before Vial could process the sheer absurdity of the report, the main communication screen forced itself open. Commander Elliot Budd was back. He was no longer drinking his coffee. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his console, his hands clasped together. "I warned you to check your systems," Bud said, his tone devoid of any malice, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "We are researchers, Commander. We observe, we calculate, we study. Please, for your own sake, do not force us to turn you into our next batch of test subjects." The sheer audacity of the human words struck Vale like a physical blow. The Kalan Empire did not retreat. They did not negotiate. And they certainly did not cower before primates playing parlor tricks with subspace mathematics. The insult burned hotter than the core of his dreadnought. "You dare mock the Imperial Vanguard!" Viel bellowed, his magnetic armor glowing white-hot with rage. "You think your tricks can stop our might? I will vaporize you and your entire sector tactical target the human vessel with the primary celestial cannon. Maximum yield. Burn them into atoms." The dreadnought shuddered as immense power was diverted from the secondary systems into the main spinal weapon. This was a cannon designed for planetary siege, a weapon capable of melting a small moon into slag. A blinding pillar of hyper-accelerated plasma gathered at the bow of the warship, screaming with apocalyptic fury. "Fire!" Vale screamed. The celestial cannon unleashed its payload. A beam of pure, unadulterated annihilation tore across the void, illuminating the dark nebula with the brightness of a dying star. It struck the human vessel dead center. But there was no explosion. There was no catastrophic breach. There was no vaporization. Instead, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The moment the superheated plasma touched the invisible barrier surrounding the human ship, it stopped. The roaring beam of stellar fire lost its momentum instantly. Then, starting from the point of impact and rushing backward toward the Kalan dreadnought, the plasma began to solidify. The temperature of the beam dropped from millions of degrees to absolute zero in a fraction of a second. Vial watched in horrifying silence as his ultimate weapon was transformed. The lethal blast of energy froze solid in the vacuum of space. It became a colossal, intricate sculpture of jagged crystal, catching the ambient light of the nebula and refracting it into 1,000 beautiful, blinding colors. A bridge of frozen energy now connected the two ships, a breathtaking monument to an impossible feat of engineering. The screen flickered. Elliot Budd was smiling now, a small, polite smile that sent a shiver of primal dread down the spine of the Kalan commander. "Thank you for the energy," Budd said softly. "We were actually running a little low on heat for the main reactor. Your donation is greatly appreciated." The awful truth began to dawn on the Kalan bridge, settling over the crew like a suffocating shroud. The United Space Command observer was not manipulating their internal computer systems. It was not spoofing their advanced sensors or overriding their mechanical controls with a cyber weapon. The horrifying reality was far worse. This seemingly insignificant, unarmed human vessel was casually rewriting the fundamental parameters of the universe around them. The human ship was twisting the very fabric of the Ring Nebula to suit its own terrifying needs. Suddenly, multiple small objects detached from the outer hull of the human ship. To the Kalan targeting sensors, they registered simply as standard escape pods, drifting lazily outward to form a wide perimeter around the dreadnought, believing the humans were finally abandoning their crippled vessel in a desperate bid for survival. Commander Vale ordered the secondary plasma batteries to intercept and destroy the fleeing lifeboats. Hundreds of superheated bolts of energy rained down on the tiny metallic pods. They did not connect. As the Kalan barrages closed in, the space around each pod warped violently. Starlight bent inward, creating dizzying halos of optical distortion. The objects were not lifeboats meant for escape. They were micro-singularity generators. Miniature black holes tore open in the vacuum, completely devouring the plasma fire. The destructive energy of the Kalan weapons was swallowed into absolute oblivion, leaving nothing behind but an empty, gravitational void. The dreadnought was now completely boxed inside a cage of inescapable gravity wells, rendering their entire arsenal utterly useless. Then, the true nightmare began. The flawless, indestructible magnetic armor of the Kalan flagship, an alloy designed to withstand the heat of a supernova and outlast entire civilizations, began to degrade. A localized time dilation field washed over the dreadnought. Within the span of a single breath, the exterior plating aged several thousand years. The brilliant metallic sheen dulled into a sickening, porous gray. Massive structural beams groaned under the immense strain of accelerated entropy. Warning klaxons blared as outer decks began to crumble into dust. The invincible warship was literally rotting away in the cold expanse of space, powerless against the unstoppable march of forced time. As the hull decayed, a new, insidious terror breached the ship. It bypassed the encrypted communication networks. It bypassed the internal acoustic dampeners. It crawled directly into the consciousness of every Kalan on board. Whispers. Vicious, scraping, guttural whispers echoing in the darkest corners of their minds. Commander Bud had not merely tapped into their audio frequencies. He had weaponized the ambient cosmic noise of the nebula itself, tuning the raw electromagnetic radiation into a psychoacoustic frequency that directly assaulted the Kalan neural networks. The plasma beings, entities entirely devoid of biological nervous systems, were suddenly experiencing a visceral sensation they had never evolved to feel. Primal, suffocating fear. The whispers sounded like a billion starving insects, scratching at their sanity, promising a dark and endless doom. Commander Vale fell to his knees. His blazing plasma form flickered wildly, dimming to a sickly, pale hue as the artificial terror consumed his mind. The absolute supremacy of the Kalan Empire shattered into pieces. His pride, built on centuries of unbroken conquest and supreme arrogance, dissolved into raw, animalistic panic. He realized he was not a hunter cornering helpless prey. He was an insect caught in the web of a godlike intellect, a force that viewed the laws of physics not as rules, but as mere suggestions. Unable to endure the psychic torment and the rapid disintegration of his flagship, Vile committed the ultimate act of military cowardice. He shattered supreme imperial protocol. With a trembling, fading hand, he smashed the emergency beacon console, transmitting a massive, wideband distress signal across the subspace network. He was calling for the Royal Armada. He was begging for the immediate deployment of all 500 capital warships of the Kalan Imperial Fleet. Across the void, aboard the fragile human science vessel, Commander Elliot Budd stood bathed in the amber glow of his monitors. He watched the massive spike in subspace telemetry as the Kalan distress signal flared out into the dark. He could have jammed the signal. He could have activated the singularity net and crushed the dreadnought before the transmission ever left the star system. But he did not. Bud simply stared at the pulsing red light on his console. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head with a profound, almost sorrowful heaviness. "You fools," Bud muttered to the empty bridge, his voice carrying the weight of the entire galaxy. "You just woke up something that should not be woken." The void of space did not simply open, it shattered. A synchronized cascade of subspace ruptures tore through the dark, bleeding blinding ultraviolet light into the dead dust of the Ring Nebula. From these jagged wounds in the fabric of reality emerged the absolute pinnacle of galactic military might. 500 Kalan Royal Armada warships translated into real space simultaneously. They were leviathans of dark, indestructible alloy and seething purple plasma, arranging themselves into a flawless, three-dimensional spherical blockade around the solitary human vessel. The sheer ambient radiation bleeding from their active engine drives unintentionally wove a colossal, crackling energy grid that spanned thousands of miles across the previously silent nebula, illuminating the cosmic dust with terrifying brilliance. Aboard the colossal command dreadnought at the zenith of the formation, the Royal Supreme Commander glared at his tactical feed. He had answered Vale's cowardly, frantic distress signal expecting to find a massive, hidden fleet of hostile human destroyers. Instead, he found exactly what the initial report stated: one minuscule, seemingly unarmed human science craft. Disgust rolled through his searing plasma form. He opened a universal, unencrypted broadcast channel, ensuring every soul and every sensor array in the sector would hear his absolute decree. "Human vessel," the Supreme Commander boomed, his voice a tidal wave of static and crushing authority that physically shook the bulkheads of the surrounded ship. "You are surrounded by 500 of the most advanced warships ever constructed in the history of this universe. There is no mathematical trick, no localized physical anomaly that can save you from this magnitude of concentrated firepower. You will power down your core, deactivate your shields, and surrender unconditionally, or you will be erased from the very fabric of existence in a single volley." On the dimly lit bridge of the human ship, Commander Elliot Budd did not frantically calculate escape vectors. He did not scream for mercy or attempt to negotiate a surrender. Instead, he leaned back heavily in his worn leather chair and began rhythmically tapping his fingers against the primary control console. When he finally looked up at the massive viewing screen, his eyes held no terror. They held a profound, devastating, and entirely genuine pity. "Supreme Commander," Bud replied, his voice soft but carrying a chilling resonance that cut right through the Kalan posturing. "Did you really think we brought a fragile science vessel all the way out into the deepest, deadest sector of this galaxy just to collect space rocks? Tell me, in all your centuries of endless conquest, have you ever paused to wonder why the Ring Nebula has been so perfectly, unnaturally quiet for millions of years?" The Kalan bridge fell perfectly silent. The question hung in the air, dripping with an ominous, suffocating weight. Bud stopped tapping the console and leaned forward, his face cast in deep shadows. "You think you are the apex predators out here," Bud continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you are the hunters closing the net, but you are just loud, obnoxious meat walking right into a sleeping lion's den with fireworks strapped to your chests." The horrifying truth finally began to unravel before the Kalan sensors. The United Space Command Observer was never an observation ship. It was a padlock. It was a cage. The entirety of the Ring Nebula, with its swirling, vibrant dust clouds and dead echoes, was not a natural astronomical phenomenon. It was a biological camouflage, a cosmic blanket covering a colossal, ancient living entity that fed entirely on raw, unrefined stellar energy. By translating 500 capital warships into the very heart of the nebula and running their massive plasma reactors at 100% capacity to maintain their combat shields, the Kalan Empire had not just brought an invasion fleet. They had brought an all-you-can-eat buffet of pure radiation. They had functioned as a blaring, radiant alarm clock. The cosmic dust surrounding the massive fleet began to swirl, not dictated by gravity, but driven by a terrifying biological intent. A low, subsonic rumble vibrated against the impenetrable hulls of the Kalan warships. A sound so deep and ancient, it bypassed audio receptors and rattled the very core of their magnetic armor. The entity was waking up, and it was starving. Knowing the charade was no longer necessary, Bud reached out and initiated the final command sequence. "Dropping the veil," he announced to his crew. The small, fragile exterior of the human science vessel shimmered and dissolved into pure, blinding light. The holographic disguise collapsed, exposing the terrifying reality of human engineering hidden beneath the illusion. The ship was not a small, harmless scout. It was a gargantuan, brutalist machine, a spatial regulator the size of a small moon. Its true hull was a nightmarish maze of massive cooling towers, hyper-dense gravitational emitters, and agonizingly strained containment field generators. It was a machine built for one singular, terrifying purpose: to keep the beast asleep. Right now, the colossal human structure was shuddering violently, its gigantic metallic spine groaning as it desperately pumped out massive gravitational waves in a futile attempt to suppress the waking Leviathan. For decades, this machine had acted as a massive tranquilizer dart, holding the cosmic horror in deep stasis. But the initial Kalan ambush, the electromagnetic net, and the forced defensive maneuvers had severely drained its core reserves. The human machine was slowly bleeding out its power, its gravitational tethers snapping one by one under the sheer strain. The cage was breaking, and the Kalan Armada was trapped inside it with the monster. The space around the Kalan Royal Armada fractured, not with blinding light, but with an absolute, suffocating absence of it. The cosmic entity, woven into the very fabric of the Ring Nebula, fully roused from its millions of years of slumber, unleashing its ravenous hunger in the form of invisible, cataclysmic gravity storms. These were not mere atmospheric disturbances or standard spatial anomalies. They were localized tidal shearing forces, shear waves of raw gravity moving at near light speed. The first invisible wave struck the outer defensive ring of the Kalan Formation, warships forged from the most resilient alloys known to the galaxy, materials meticulously designed to withstand direct orbital bombardments and stellar flares, were caught in the unseen currents. The massive vessels twisted and contorted violently. Armor plating shrieked a deafening, agonizing metallic wail before the ships were violently ripped apart like thin, wet paper. Entire dreadnoughts, each carrying thousands of elite crew members, crumpled into unrecognizable jagged spheres of compressed debris in a fraction of a second. The vacuum of space was suddenly filled with a churning debris field of pulverized Kalan pride, their invincible fleet reduced to scrap metal in the blink of an eye. Panic, raw and absolute, infected the previously disciplined Armada, operating on pure survival instinct and rigid military doctrine. The remaining Kalan captains bypassed their supreme commander and ordered a synchronized, desperate counter-barrage. Thousands of plasma batteries, hyper-velocity particle lances, and devastating antimatter torpedoes were unleashed simultaneously into the churning cosmic dust clouds. It was a display of concentrated firepower, entirely capable of sterilizing a small solar system. But they were firing at a ghost. The ancient entity possessed no physical form to shatter, no centralized biological core to pierce. It was a vast, decentralized consciousness, composed entirely of cosmic energy strands. As the devastating Kalan barrage detonated against the shifting nebula, the entity did not recoil or bleed. It inhaled. The terrifying heat and explosive radiation were instantly absorbed, greedily feeding the colossal beast. The more fiercely the Armada fought, the faster the gravitational storms intensified, directly fueled by the very weapons meant to destroy them. The Kalan were rapidly digging their own graves with every single trigger pull. At the absolute epicenter of the fleet formation, reality warped into a severe, concave depression. A localized singularity, a ravenous maw of infinite density, tore open right beneath the magnificent flagship of the Supreme Commander. The colossal dreadnought, the absolute pinnacle and pride of the entire Kalan Empire, was caught in the inescapable undertow. Its massive engines screamed, burning at 120% capacity, pouring out oceans of thrust. But it was entirely useless. The flagship was being dragged backward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the black event horizon. Complete erasure from galactic history was no longer an abstract threat. It was a mathematical certainty arriving in less than 60 seconds. Inside the crumbling bridge, the indomitable spirit of the Kalan officers finally shattered. The centuries of drilled superiority, The absolute belief in their divine right to conquer dissolved into the primal, desperate need to simply survive. A transmission burst from the struggling flagship, unencrypted and broadcasting wildly on all known emergency frequencies. It was not a demand. It was a fractured, panicked plea aimed directly at the people they had come to enslave. Human vessel. The voice of a high-ranking Kalan officer sobbed openly over the static. Save us. Please. We beg you. On the dimly lit bridge of the massive human spatial regulator, there was absolutely no cheering. There were no smug smiles, no arrogant laughter, and no sarcastic remarks about cosmic karma. Commander Elliot Budd did not waste a single, precious second relishing the poetic justice of the moment. His face hardened into a mask of cold, calculated determination. "Cut all defensive dampeners immediately," Budd barked, his hands flying across his control console with blinding speed. "Reroute every single ounce of our remaining power to the primary tether bays. Initiate the emergency rescue protocol." The human crew moved with frantic, disciplined precision. The gigantic, brutalist structure groaned loudly as it forcefully realigned its massive internal systems, dropping its own protective shields to prioritize raw pulling power. From the heavy, armored bays of the observer vessel, massive, reinforced harpoons attached to incredibly thick cables of woven dark matter fired out into the chaotic void. Simultaneously, human pilots in heavily modified, hyper-maneuverable tug ships decoupled from the main hull, diving straight into the screaming heart of the gravity storms. It was an act of pure, suicidal madness. The small human crafts pulled brutal, high-velocity maneuvers that would have instantly liquefied a Kalan pilot. They aggressively dodged massive chunks of floating debris, intentionally riding the jagged edges of the gravitational shear waves to manually guide the heavy dark matter cables toward the spiraling Kalan warships. They were actively throwing themselves into the ravenous mouth of the cosmic beast to save the very beings who had ordered their execution just minutes prior. The surviving Kalan crews watched through their view screens in stunned, absolute silence as a small human tug ship took a glancing blow from a gravity eddy. Its port engine violently exploded, sending the craft spinning out of control. Yet the pilot managed to stabilize, forcing the thrusters beyond their breaking point to continue steering the massive dark matter cable forward. The harpoon slammed hard into the hull of the Supreme Commander's flagship, magnetically locking on just 50 meters away from the Singularity's deadly edge. The fundamental Kalan ideology of ruthless dominance shattered completely in that exact moment, replaced by a profound, trembling awe at the sheer, terrifying empathy of humanity. The dark matter tethers strained against the immense gravitational pull, groaning with the sound of snapping tectonic plates. Commander Elliot Budd watched his tactical monitors bleed red as the structural integrity of his own ship plummeted. Pulling the Kalan warships from the edge of the Singularity was merely treating a symptom. The cosmic entity was fully awake now, and its hunger was expanding exponentially. It would not stop until it had consumed every single starship in the sector, human and Kalan alike. The cables were simply not enough. Budd needed to create a spatial blind spot, a distraction massive enough to trick the primordial beast and satiate its boundless appetite. "Initiate Project Sandgrain," Budd ordered, his voice echoing in the rapidly cooling bridge. "Eject the primary antimatter reactor core. Divert all emergency backup power to the magnetic compression coils." The human crew froze for a fraction of a second. Ejecting the main core meant sacrificing their only source of true power, dooming themselves to drift in the freezing void, a floating tomb in the absolute zero of deep space. Yet, not a single officer hesitated. They bypassed the safety protocols and executed the command. Deep within the heavily armored belly of the spatial regulator, the massive, throbbing heart of the vessel violently detached. The human ship did not intend to use the antimatter core to create a catastrophic explosion. Instead, the incredibly advanced containment fields clamped down on the unstable, volatile matter, crushing it inward with terrifying force. The core was rapidly compressed, its density multiplying 1 billion times over, until the pressure forced it to ignite into a blinding, super-dense artificial white dwarf star. It was a perfect, miniature sun, humming with impossible, crushing mass. With a final, desperate burst of the remaining auxiliary thrusters, the observer launched the artificial star directly into the swirling, invisible mouth of the cosmic storm. The entity immediately locked onto the new, overwhelming energy signature. It abandoned its merciless assault on the battered, dying fleet, lunging blindly toward the blinding white dwarf. As the massive biological storm swallowed the artificial star, a profound physical reaction occurred. The immense, concentrated gravity of the white dwarf began aggressively pulling all the violently scattered ambient radiation and excess energy back into its center. It acted as an infinite sinkhole, forcibly feeding the entity the equivalent of 1 million blazing suns in a matter of seconds. The cosmic beast was rapidly overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated density of the meal. Its violent, tearing gravity waves softened, then stabilized, and finally ceased altogether. Gorgeously vibrant starlight returned to the Ring Nebula as the fully satiated entity immediately fell back into a deep, heavy slumber, destined to sleep entirely undisturbed for millions of years to come. In the sudden, absolute silence of the void, the United Space Command observer went entirely dark. Without its reactor core, the colossal machine was a dead, drifting hulk in the freezing vacuum of space. The outer hull was heavily scorched, completely compromised, and rapidly losing internal heat. Yet, against all mathematical odds, the entire human crew was alive, and miraculously, so were the shattered remnants of the once mighty Kalan Imperial Armada. A flickering, low bandwidth transmission forced its way onto the frozen bridge of the human ship. The holographic projector sputtered, revealing the battered, dimmed plasma form of the Kalan Supreme Commander. His majestic magnetic armor was cracked and practically ruined, leaking faint trails of plasma into the air. He did not issue a command. He did not boast. His towering pride had been entirely eradicated. "Why?" the Supreme Commander asked, his synthesized voice trembling with a heavy, agonizing mix of absolute shame and profound confusion. "Why did you not leave us to die in the dark? We came to conquer you. We tried to kill you without a second thought." Commander Elliot Budd stood in the freezing darkness of his crippled bridge. His breath materialized in thick, white plumes of condensation. He looked directly into the eyes of his former enemy, his expression carrying the ancient, solitary burden of his entire species. "The galactic warning does not exist to protect human ships from you," Bud replied, his voice a steady, quiet thunder that would resonate across the history of the universe forever. "It exists to stop you from accidentally ruining the cosmic janitorial work we do every single day." On that day, the Kalan Empire forged a sacred blood oath, an unbreakable law etched into their very genetics, promising to never again draw a weapon against humanity. The ancient warning of the galaxy was forever altered. A new line was inscribed into the collective memory of 1,000 civilizations. Never ambush a human ship, because they are the only wall keeping the dark from swallowing us all. Thank you so much for listening to our story today. We would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please share your location in the comments below. If you found this tale compelling, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can help by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link located in the description or the comments section. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated team, helping them provide for their families and ensuring we can continue crafting and sharing these wonderful adventures with you. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next story.